In this lecture, we will now move into the world of practice, and we will look at the strategies that are used, dominant strategies to promote to promote creative economy. And in this lecture, we will focus on the entrepreneurial side of the creative economy. And what does it mean to be entrepreneurial in the creative economy? We will use the work done by an article written by Tom Agason, who himself is a creative cultural entrepreneur based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He and a co-founder were probably one of the first ones to even come about with the term cultural entrepreneurship, and now their organization is called creativestartups.org. So fascinating examples as a practitioner in terms of cultural entrepreneurship. The second piece of literature or work we'll use is a TED Talk by another cultural entrepreneur, Joanna Taft, who has been working with at-risk youth in Indianapolis and really brought about a large sort of cultural entrepreneurial school and all kinds of components to it, but really a cultural entrepreneurial initiative to address a dominant social problem in that area. So that's the founding material that we will use in this conversation here. And the key questions we want to answer through this dialogue here are, first of all, generate our own individual understanding of who are cultural entrepreneurs. And again, let me remind you that I will use the term cultural entrepreneur, creative entrepreneur interchangeably to mean one and the same, right? So who are cultural entrepreneurs? What's their role in the society? Do they actually have anything to do with, social issues, kinds of things? And do they play the same role as commercial entrepreneurs would play in the society, right? Do all cultural entrepreneurs exhibit common properties? Are there some similarities or some underpinnings of cultural entrepreneurs? And what about the organizations they create, or the enterprises or ventures, whatever you want to call them? What about them? What kind of characteristics do they exhibit? Are they similar to any other commercial enterprise? Are non-profit cultural enterprises similar to for-profit cultural enterprises? So we'll take a look at that. And what might be some emerging organizational forms that support the cultural and creative entrepreneurship? What are some emerging forms of investments that are useful for cultural entrepreneurs? Their processes in terms of production, distribution of cultural goods and services. Are they similar to sort of the utility-driven commercial enterprises, what they produce? So those are some questions we'll try to explain here, gain an understanding of in terms of the entrepreneurial side. So to begin with, I'll just state two examples here, and then we'll follow through these examples in the discussion throughout. So the first example is that of an organization created by Stephanie Odegaard, working in Nepal, where there is a very traditional form of weaving based on all local natural materials, including the dyes, the natural dyes. And the form of weaving, what she's found way back, I believe this is in the 70s, she found that there are communities and women who are impoverished, but actually have this fascinating hand skill or artisan skill with them that was not being exploited for the right reasons. So what she did was she started a cultural enterprise venture where women participate, and they're not just employees, but they're actually a part of the organization. They have ownership stake of the organization, and they use their traditional skills to weave, in this case beginning with carpets, and I believe the product line has expanded now. But they create products and weaving products, carpets included, for more modern markets, right? So that's one enterprise. So by virtue of that, not only is the culture being preserved and modernized, and more people being made aware of this form of weaving, but also it's generating economic activity and it's benefiting the communities back there, helping with the education and health and other kinds of social issues that exist in the communities. So that's one example. The other example is more recent, and it's from the United States here. If you go to the West Coast, a few years ago, this organization started. It's called ITSA, and often in the United States, we have had fast food culture a lot, and for health benefits, particularly amongst sort of the professional communities who are busy with work and do not necessarily have the time to have fresh food, healthy food, this organization came up and said we have to bring about a change to the eating habits so that, but cater to the fast food notion, because we respect the fact that these are busy working professionals. And they started this restaurant called ITSA, where the tagline is better, faster food. So it's all healthy, fresh quinoa kinds of salads that are made, but they're delivered at extremely affordable price. And how does this happen? This is nexus of creativity, technology. So they claim that this is a restaurant that has zero human interface. So how you place orders, how you pick up your orders, it's all automated and technology based. So that's why it can be cheap, right? So it's better, faster food. And this is a whole culture that is being created now in terms of respecting and benefiting from fresh, healthy food, but at the same time, making it affordable. So these are two examples. We'll sort of use this throughout this discussion here. But then coming back to then who are these cultural entrepreneurs, right? Cultural entrepreneurs here can be thought of as individuals, sometimes organizations or groups of people, as change agents, because they're leveraging the assets, often their cultural assets, to create innovation and to create communities that are going to be thriving communities. Thriving in the sense of both the non-monetary side as well as monetary side. So it's thriving economic systems, but also health and well-being of the communities. So really cultural entrepreneurs are change agents in that regard, right? And Tom Agassiz uses the term that they're bedrock of the creative economy, which I think is fascinating term. These cultural entrepreneurs are also visionaries. So they have a bigger goal and vision in mind because they're change agents, right? So you have to have, you need to envision a better future for the communities that you're going to be working with. And for that, they tend to be mission driven to achieve that, envisioned state. But at the same time, they're extremely market focused, which means that they have to make sure that they're creating economic systems behind it that are thriving. So unlike charitable work, philanthropic work, which is also good, which needs to happen, so I'm not discounting that. But cultural entrepreneurs try and create systems that can go together, economic and well-being systems. So that's unique about them. You can think of them as the ones who are able to spot a missing link between cultural assets and markets. So they see this link, they're able to envision a link, and through creativity, innovation, make that link happen. Like we saw in the case of Odegaard Carpets, Stephanie Odegaard is the one who was able to see market potential, possibility of creating wealth, but also a change that was needed in the communities. And then she figured out the arbitrage that existed and, turning cultural assets into value-oriented products that can be taken to markets. So the revenue arbitrage that existed between the cost of producing something to taking it to market for value-added, price, value-based pricing that comes in. So that's what they form the missing link. They see the revenue arbitrage. They're relentless networkers, because what we're talking about is a social change, which means that I think most people recognize that social change cannot be produced by individuals and their individual organization. It's an ecosystem of participants that have to come in. For example, in this case of Odegaard Carpets, it's not just about providing income to the women who participate in weaving. It is also about making sure that their children can go to school, which means there have to be schools in the area, they get access to clean water, They have, other health services over there, which this organization, Odegaard Carpets, cannot do by themselves. By definition, they have to rely on others, which means they have to be relentless networkers in this process. Now, they also are risk takers, different than regular entrepreneurs. All entrepreneurs take risks. Nobody denies that. In this case, not only do they have the same risks that commercial entrepreneurs would have, they have greater risks because they're also talking about social change, and you don't know, because you're talking about human creativity and products of human creativity, you don't know whether those products will be accepted by the markets or not. That itself is an inherent risk. And then there is everything related to collaborations and partners coming in and working. So there is greater risk that they're willing to undertake in this case. And they're leaders because they're really thinking about solving problems for communities here, right? And they're anchored in values with an attitude towards sort of, authenticity and retaining the authenticity of the culture and creativity. So for example, Itza, if it drops its entire sort of healthy food and really starts looking at procuring food from faraway distances and compromising on the core of their mission, which is healthy food in some ways, then they lose authenticity and credibility and legitimacy amongst their customers and stakeholders, right? Not shareholders. So clearly, cultural entrepreneurs need to be authentic in what they're doing and be true to the culture to the extent of the producers of the culture and value and the consumers both, right? And like Joanna Taft would say, cultural entrepreneurs need to have grit and perseverance to make their vision reality. Now, cultural entrepreneurs, obviously, we know that any entrepreneur operates at the intersection of innovation and business. There is a third dimension that comes in here, which is culture, in terms of deep-rooted beliefs and systems. And since cultural entrepreneurs are talking about producing change, there is some change to culture. In the case of Odegaard Carpets, it has to do with how people like us perceive that culture, right? By virtue of getting people to consume the cultural product, work of art. It's not about just putting the product in someone's hand, but it is also about greater education around what goes into that weaving, how does that happen, why is it important, and how does it help with sustainability of the environment. So there is a lot of education that needs to happen that goes along with it if you want to really produce a cultural change of some sorts. So there is a completely new dimension that's added to what cultural entrepreneurs do. And one way to think about this is sort of the 4 C's approach, where there is a strong interplay between these 4. For example, we know that there is a cultural element, there is a trade element, commerce, there is consumption element to it as consumers of the cultural work and cultural product. But the key component, which doesn't get talked about a lot, is the commentary component, which has to do with that sort of the house that talks about the cultural value for whether it's for producers, consumers, distributors, whoever it is in this entire value chain. So the commentary is the one that's really important to facilitate change in the minds of consumers, to influence the values and beliefs about what is appropriate and what is valuable, right? It's the dialogue and discourse, debate sometimes, that's really important in producing that change. So the commentary component becomes really important to legitimize over time the acts of cultural entrepreneurship. So coming back to then seeing if that's what cultural entrepreneurs do and that's what they are, how different are they from commercial entrepreneurs? I think I've kind of laid that out a bit as I talked in terms of the risk-taking, in terms of the added dimension of culture that is involved. But how are they different than what some might call as social entrepreneurs, right? If you know social entrepreneurship, like cultural and creative entrepreneurship, it's kind of, it doesn't have a unique definition to it, but at the core of it, it is about social change. in communities and solving problems for communities. The key difference is when you talk about social entrepreneurship creates room for traditional non-profit approaches to solving social problems. It has a big component to it which accepts that, while they also use business practices. But also social entrepreneurship is primarily about solving a problem for a community. And to the extent that once that problem is solved, social entrepreneurs have no reason to be in business of what they were doing. Unlike that, cultural entrepreneurs, while they are looking at solving problems, they're also looking at facilitating and producing cultural change in one or more of the communities. So to that extent, they might be different. Same with environmental, sustainable entrepreneurship. We won't answer all of them here, but I'll seed some of these terms for you to think about, how might they be different than those who work in environmental entrepreneurship, and if they're different. And those who claim to be having triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits. That means organizations that cater to their people, cater to the environmental sustainability, and cater to having profits for shareholders and stakeholders. So are cultural entrepreneurs different than those? I would argue that they're different in some regards, with cultural assets being so central to what cultural entrepreneurs do, and the cultural change in beliefs and norms and values that are front and center of what cultural entrepreneurs are, and at the center of who they are essentially. So to that extent, there are differences with each one of these that we just laid out, and I haven't talked about all. Organizations can shift in the continuum along this line, and cultural entrepreneurs, at some point when the cultural shifts have been produced, they may choose to not be in existence, but may choose to be in existence because culture is dynamic and living and it evolves. So there's constant place for them to be around in the ecosystem that we're talking about. So one other dimension of the cultural goods and services that are created by cultural enterprises and entrepreneurs, like we looked at one of the previous discussions, they're products of human creativity. So they're creative products, and they're inputs of people, creative workers, and cultural assets, unlike traditional raw materials that form inputs to any kind of commercial enterprise. So cultural enterprises recognize the talent in people, recognize what drives creatives to produce, imagine, and they have to deal with such people who are possessed with the creative sides of things, right? Much different than other employees that organizations might have. The goods we have talked about, they're not commoditized. They serve a purpose which is greater than utility, right? So we have to remind ourselves of that here. And in that regards, they're taking risk, because it's likely that what I perceive as good, you may not perceive as, of value to you. So that risk exists. And cultural entrepreneurs in their work and the cultural goods and services actually serve the producers, because the producers engaged in making the goods and services are applying their own individual creativity to it. So they serve producers, they certainly serve consumers, but they tend to serve everybody along this value chain of, distributors and, producers in terms of not just those who make, conceptualize, but organizations that are intermediaries in this process. So each one of them is served through the core cultural component that's being created in the organization. So they're different in all these regards. And finally, if you look at cultural enterprises, you will see that they tend to have a long tail, which means there are few organizations that are large in size, but most other cultural enterprises or creative enterprises are small, medium, and micro enterprises. So that's sort of the distribution that's dominant in every single country where measurement is happening. In the United States, we find that cultural entrepreneurship actually can be for-profit. They can also be non-profit status companies. Some states have special structures, legal structures like the L3C, and then more recently we have B corporates in the United States. In the UK, an equivalent form is community interest corporations. That's a form that promotes creative entrepreneurship or supports creative entrepreneurship. In terms of the financing that's required, these enterprises, with all the risks that they have, they often cannot access traditional financing that commercial entrepreneurs have access to, whether it is venture financing or other forms, debt and equity financing. So there are special needs of financing creative enterprises, and what you find in the United States is part of non-profit financing, like the program-related investments, mission-related investments, they are accessible and available to creative enterprises, cultural enterprises. But also a lot to do with microfinancing has been dominant here. And some social venture funds are taking roots, and there are also ways in which cultural enterprises, creative enterprises are being funded in the United States particularly. So in summary, entrepreneurship has a strong role to play to foster and promote creative economy, to benefit communities that otherwise might remain underserved or underprivileged in this notion. So it becomes an inclusive approach to economic and overall development of communities.